Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Devin. I'm joined by my friend JD, or Jonathan DeRogers, and we are here today to talk about best practices for WordPress site maintenance and security. Now, this is one of those topics that is not as glamorous to talk about as some other topics, such as improving your speed, but it is absolutely critical. Here at Bluehost, we often have these conversations with people when their site has already been hacked or is already in a bad position. So we wanted to make sure that we came on to the webinar today and talked with everyone about how you can improve the security on your WordPress website and make sure that we're proactive in securing our WordPress websites instead of reactive. We want to make sure that we do as much as we can before a hack happens. So that's what we'll be getting into today. But before we get into that, a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, I'm joined today by Jonathan DeRogers. He is a senior software engineer at Bluehost, and in addition is a WordPress core committer, has been the lead on a handful of WordPress releases, and is very, very close to the WordPress project. As always, my name is Devin Sears. I'm the Senior Field Marketing Manager for Bluehost, and I will be your co-host today. A few other quick housekeeping items before we jump into the content of today's webinar. First off, audio. If you can hear us, find the chat on the side and tell us where you're tuning in from. We always love to hear where people are joining us from, and we always love to hear that our audio is working correctly. So if you can find the chat and let us know where you're dropping in from, that is helpful. If you found the chat box, you might have also found the Q&A box, which is right next to it. It's a tab right next to it. If you have any questions, please ask those questions in that area, and I will do my best to answer them as the webinar goes on. If there's any questions that I am not sure on, or if we need more information or more a deeper answer, then I'll hold those questions to the Q&A section at the end. We will have a short Q&A section at the end, so please ask your questions. If you need any help, if you lose audio or anything, the best thing to do is usually just restart this, rejoin the webinar, and you can do that by reloading the page. And otherwise, just drop something in the chat to let me know that there might be some technical issue that we need to take a look at. So, housekeeping out. One other thing that is always asked multiple times, we will be recording this, and we will be sending a recording out to everyone that is registered and attending today. So we're grateful to have you here with us. We're excited to have you here. Let's get into what we'll be covering. First of all, we're going to go into understanding WordPress security. So talking about what it is, what different variables play a role when you're trying to secure your WordPress website. Then we'll go into essential steps for securing your website. So talking about what you can do to make sure your website is secure. And then we will get into best practices for maintaining a WordPress site. Part of security is maintenance. It's not just a one-stop and then you're done type of situation. And then we'll get into some pro tips for advanced WordPress security to, if you want to take it an extra level in security. And then obviously responding to security incidents. If your site is hacked, if you do find an issue, we want to walk you through a couple tips on how you can resolve that. So before we get into that, I'm just letting you know I'll be off camera responding to as many chats and questions as I can. That's to save you all from watching me watch my other screen. But without any further ado, JD, please take it away.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. And I'm really excited to give you some more information on how to keep your site secure, and hopefully you won't have to deal with any, any exploitation or anything like that on your website. So before we talk about having better security, we have to talk about understanding it a little bit. And a key to that is understanding what your website is. So if you're on Bluehost, we set every customer up with a WordPress installation by default. You can have many, you can have, 10, 20 websites, but every new website you create at Bluehost will start as a WordPress install. So WordPress is basically a PHP application. PHP is the programming language that runs WordPress, and that runs on your website host. And your data is stored in a database, which is usually MySQL. It consists of member-generated content like blog posts and pages, and user-generated content such as comments. And the website also is the other component of a website is always your domain name and the corresponding DNS configuration. DNS stands for domain name servers, and that is essentially what gets where the request to your website goes. And it's like a traffic controller. It tells the requesting user, their browser, where the website can be downloaded from. And then it's also important to understand some of the common types of vulnerabilities. You don't need to know what these are or how they work, but you'll probably see these mentioned somewhere, especially if you're researching WordPress security and website security. Your site can be infected with malware. There's something called a cross-site scripting vulnerability, which essentially someone can put some malicious code in your website and it will cause something unexpected or unintentional to happen on your website. You can have a MySQL injection. That's essentially where someone can pass some bad commands to your database and it will return more data than is expected or wipe out data. Brute force vulnerabilities is where a bot or a collection of bots will attempt to guess a password, and they'll just do so by brute forcing it, where they just make request after request, and they're just testing different passwords. Password 1, password 2, password 3, password 4, and they'll just go through over and over and over again until they can figure out the password. We'll talk about that one a little bit more in further on in the presentation. Another one is social engineering. So this would be in the form of phishing attacks, or essentially it would be someone trying to think that you're doing the right thing, but you're not. So saying that your bank account was compromised, or there was a transaction that was larger than expected, and you go in and you say, oh no, what's going on here, and you log right in, but really it's a fake form and they're just trying to get your information. So now let's take those vulnerabilities and let's pull them back in and relate them to WordPress and your website. Where can these vulnerabilities be, and how can they affect you? So the first one is that the vulnerabilities could be in WordPress core files themselves. So we talked about WordPress is a PHP and MySQL application. There could be vulnerabilities in the WordPress core software itself, and that could be an attack vector. There is a WordPress security team, and I'm actually on it, and we accept reports, and we are always responding to those and releasing security releases. We'll talk about that in the future. But if there are any WordPress security issues, they do get patched and they do get fixed. And so that's something to have some peace of mind there. Your theme files or your plugin files, like WordPress, could also have some security vulnerabilities in them. The level of response varies for this. Good plugin and theme developers will be mindful of this and have ways to report security issues, and they will respond with security updates, and they will get those fixed for you. Not so good ones, they may not be as reactive, and we'll also talk about that in a little bit further on how to make good choices in that sense. Another attack vector is bad actors. So you could have disgruntled or former employees. You could have contractors that used to work for you that don't anymore, but they might still have a login, and they might log in and deface your website in some way. Having outdated software, like anything else, you should keep all your software up to date. So in this context, it's going to be in the form of PHP and MySQL. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. And then the last one would be poor infrastructure, such as your hosting. So having a host that is not proactive about security, you might be more apt to be vulnerable to different attacks. So let's go over some essential steps that are fairly straightforward and easy, and anybody can do these. Everybody should do these. I talked about the best thing you can do is keeping your software up to date. And thankfully, WordPress is very easy to do that. I talked about there's a security team. There's also different release teams that there's about 3 WordPress releases every year. Those are in the form of major releases. And major releases would be we're currently on 6.2 at the time of recording this. The next major release will be 6.3, and 6.4 will be the next one after that. Within that, they have minor releases, and so we're on 6.2.2 is the most recent one. Once 6.3 gets out, the next minor release will be 6.3.1, and so on. The differences are really in just what is included in these releases. So major releases, we're allowed to ship new features and APIs, as well as bug fixes and enhancements. But within minor releases, we only ship bug fixes and security patches and self-confined refinements. So very small refinements that just improve on features that were released in the previous major release. And so at a minimum, you should be applying all of the minor updates automatically. WordPress makes this really easy to do. All new WordPress websites will actually install major and minor releases by default. If you have any questions about this or you're not sure, you can actually update this in your Bluehost dashboard. The other piece of software that we talked about at the beginning was plugins and themes. And I mentioned about choosing reputable authors. Those people are more likely to maintain their themes in a favorable way to you. They will do not only security updates, but bug fixes, enhancements, and all of those good things. Keeping these files up to date are very important. You want to have auto updates enabled, just like you do WordPress core updates. And that is enabled by default for all Bluehost customers. So if you haven't touched any of these settings or don't recall changing anything related to that, then you're probably already receiving all of the updates for your plugins and themes. If you're not sure, you can go into your WordPress dashboard and go to the Bluehost dashboard, and you'll see here in the image that it's pointing to where you can check that your updates are turned on. And finally, you can remove your excess plugins and themes. That's also another measure that you can take to ensure security. So a plugin or theme that you don't have active, it is possible for there to be malicious code stored within those plugins that could be exploited in certain circumstances. So just as an extra safety measure, a lot of site owners will install and try several plugins and themes before they find the best ones that suit their business needs or their preference. But then they'll just disable them and move on, and they just kind of stay there all the time. And even though they might auto update behind the scenes, that risk is still there. And so it's just about minimizing the potential for having risk. The number one thing that I see as a weak point for anybody on any website is not using a secure password. So, don't reuse passwords on multiple sites. If you use on Facebook, you have a password that you use on Twitter, that you use on your website. If there's a data exposure where someone is able to hack those services and get a list of passwords and usernames and emails, what they'll do is the hacker will post those somewhere on the internet, and other hackers will grab it and use that in the future. And so the next time, maybe they are trying to hack maybe Twitter, and these are totally made up scenarios, but maybe Twitter has a data exposure and usernames and passwords are leaked. What hackers would do is they will take that list and then they'll go to Facebook and they'll try to use those credentials to log into user accounts. And then they'll go to banks and then they go to other things. And so when hackers are trying to exploit websites, they might even try your WordPress website, depending on how large it is or how many users there are, just because it's in their best interest to control as many sites or have access to as many sites as possible. So I always recommend using a password manager. Most of the browsers nowadays have this built in where it might pop up after you log in. It says, "Would you like to remember your password?" So clicking yes would basically remember that securely within the browser that you're using, and you'll be able to next time not have to remember that password. And so that's great because you can have a really long random password that is very secure. And it might be a little hard to see here, but if you have a password that is, let's see, if it is 11 characters long and it only has numbers, it's going to take 2 seconds to guess. So you can greatly extend the time that it will take someone to guess your password by having numbers, letters, uppercase and lowercase, and symbols. And random is the best. You don't want to use words if you can, because when someone's trying to brute force your site, they will use a dictionary attack, which basically they'll have a list of words and they try them in different combinations, and that makes it really easy to guess. So you definitely want to have a randomized password, and password managers will help you with that. So definitely check that out if that's new to you. Another great feature that we have at Bluehost is when you're changing your WordPress password, it will also check a known list of uh, passwords that have been leaked. And so if the password you're trying to use, which it may not necessarily be associated with you, but if it's in a list somewhere that has been leaked to other hackers, it will say, hey, this password might not be the best to use because it's actually been exposed by someone in the past. So that's another great feature that we have at Bluehost when you're going to change your password, and that will go for any user on your website. So it's not only administrators. Another one that is just absolutely essential to having a website today is SSL certificate. So an SSL certificate is used to create a secure connection between the browser that the person is using and the server that the website is on. And this primarily prevents something called a man-in-the-middle attack. So if there's someone on your network, the same Wi-Fi network as you, and this could be, your home network, and you just don't know that person's there, or at a cafe somewhere, they could be on the same network. And if you are communicating with a website that does not have an SSL certificate, they can see everything that you're sending to that website and everything that the website is sending back to you in plain text. So having an SSL certificate will encrypt that data, and so it makes it unreadable. And so then that person that's sitting there and listening to the traffic on the network will be unable to tell what you're sending and what's being sent back to you. And so this is essential, especially if you have a e-commerce site, because you do not want your customers' data to be exposed. Whether it's what they're ordering or their credit card information, you do not want that to be in plain text being sent over the wire. All Bluehost sites get one of these by default, and they're free and on many service providers nowadays. But there are some paid ones that you can get that are more sophisticated. They will basically, more expensive SSL certificates will come with additional levels of verification. And with that will come some warranty. So some of them will have like up to $10,000 warranty if something were to happen where data would be exposed. That was the fault of the certificate issuer. And the easiest way to tell whether you have this or not is to look for the HTTPS at the beginning of the website URL in your browser instead of HTTP. And if you have any questions about this or you need help getting an SSL certificate, please reach out to Bluehost support, and they will be more than happy and able to help you get set up with one. Additionally, there are some popular security plugins that you can use. Cloudflare is a great one for protecting your DNS. So you would have your DNS records there, and that works as basically a distributed crowdsource for vulnerabilities and malicious traffic. So if someone goes to my site and it turns out that they are a bad actor, and then your site is also on Cloudflare, and then they try to go to your website, they'll already know that that person is trying to cause harm to websites and act accordingly. Jetpack's another great one. Jetpack has some protection against brute force attacks. They have some wide area firewall. They have all kinds of different things like that where you can activate those features to your liking. CodeGuard performs some backups for you. SiteLock, WordFence, all of these are reputable plugins in the space that you'll be able to use to help with different hardening tasks for your website. So let's talk a little bit about maintaining a WordPress website and what this means in this context. So the number one thing when you're maintaining a website that you want to do is to perform regular backups. How often you should back up really depends on your website. Maybe you write on your website once a month, but you get, occasional comments. So maybe once a week would be good for you. Daily is always best if possible, and most of the backup service providers will do daily, and some will even do every time there's a change, it will know and it will back up in that way. You can back up to your web server, and some plugins will do that, but I also recommend having a offsite backup as well. And so if there's a catastrophic failure and something happens and the server that your website is on is lost, is broken, then having it offsite somewhere is always preferred. I personally, I back up my site. I do that on my web server. I have a service that does it, and then I also download those backups regularly to have them on my machine. And so if my machine were to get destroyed in a fire or something of that nature, I always have the remote backup, and I always have the backup on my web server as well. How you get your backup will depend based on or vary based on which service you're using. So, reach out to them to know how to access those. It's good to do that before you have an issue so that you can access them more quickly when that happens. And also know how to perform a restore on your website if you do encounter a security issue. And again, that will depend service provider to service provider. So do a little research ahead of time proactively, like Devin said, act proactively and be prepared for any issues that you might encounter. This is probably another one of the most common issues I see when it comes to site maintenance and security out there in the wild. And that's not limiting user access to your website. And so what that means is WordPress comes with the ability to assign different roles to different users. So if you are a site owner, you are likely an administrator on the website. And that allows you to basically do anything. But say you have people that write content or that approve comments. Those people probably shouldn't have the same level of access as you. And so having everybody as an administrator is not really appropriate or safe. You would probably want them to be an editor, or if someone is just writing content and you don't want them to have the ability to publish it, you want to review it first, that would be a contributor. And many plugins will have their own custom roles built in. In this screenshot, you can see there's an SEO editor, an SEO manager, a shop manager. And they'll all come with their own levels of access. So always think to yourself when you're adding a new person to work on your website or help you with your website is what is the maximum amount of stuff I want them to do? Like only give them the minimum amount of access required for them to do what they need to. And similarly, when people move on or are fired or their contract is up for helping you, removing that access at that time is also important. And so, maybe you want it to stay where it still looks like the content came from them as the author. Then in that case, you wouldn't need to delete the user. You could just make them a subscriber, and a subscriber can only read the contents of the website. They can't log in and change plugins. They can't write posts. They can't do any of that. But just downgrading those former employees or former folks that used to help you with your website is a great way to help prevent anybody that might not feel the best about you, or if their password, they might have used a bad password, and if their account information gets leaked, and then that leaves your site open to potentially being hacked. So it's just another one less factor to have in the long term. Choosing a reliable hosting provider is also one of the most important things. Most of the things that happen to keep your website secure, you'll never know about. And that might be in the form of a WordPress update. That might be in the form of all the way up to an infrastructure update that your hosting provider does to keep your site secure. So a lot of hosting providers know about security issues that are getting announced or being found, and they're proactively adding safety measures to their infrastructure to prevent these attacks from even making it to your website and working. So some things to keep in mind with that is, do they keep PHP up to date? Do they have a good track record? Do they have accessible customer support that you can reach out to and ask questions? Get help if you're having an issue. Bluehost has a security team that is always constantly taking steps to prevent our customers from being exposed to security vulnerabilities whenever we can. But these are some good questions to ask if you're evaluating a hosting provider. Site performance and load times. We're not going to talk too much about this because it's not super related to security. It's more of a maintenance item, which we are touching on. That's why I'm mentioning it. But we recently did a entirely separate webinar on this topic. And so if you're interested in this, I recommend you go and check that out. But some of the core metrics you can use to evaluate your site's performance and load times would be, the core web vitals that Google talks about, which is how it evaluates how your site renders and how quickly and how quickly it's perceived. And focusing on those will help you have a faster website. So check out that other webinar if you're interested in this, and I'm sure Devin will drop the link to that in the chat for us. So maybe you've done all of this, or maybe you know all of this already. It's always a good refresher to go through these again, but here are some more advanced tips that you can look at if you want to go the extra mile and ensure that your site is secure. I'm sure that we all have some exposure by now to something called two-factor authentication, or 2FA. Most financial institutions have this now, but two-factor authentication is something you know and something you have. And so that will come in the form of something you know is your password, and something you have would be your mobile device or your computer with two-factor authentication configured. And so this is really great because someone can guess your password and it doesn't matter unless they have your phone or access to your phone as well to intercept the text message or use the application that's going to give you a different code that you have to enter to match. Some services also do push notifications, like Gmail. When you try to log in and it doesn't recognize the computer that you're using, it will send you a push notification on your phone, and you have to say yes or no. This is me. This is not me, before it allows that login to complete. And so there's different forms of this, but that's essentially what it is. There are ways to set this up in WordPress. This is an example of what it might look like when trying to log in on WordPress with 2FA enabled. There's several plugins that will do that, and the WordPress team is looking at potentially including this in WordPress by default in the future. But at this time, you do need to use a plugin to accomplish this. I mentioned PHP and MySQL. So keeping these up to date can be an advanced topic because most hosting providers won't update this for you proactively. they will apply security updates to the version you're on, but they may not proactively bump you to newer versions. PHP basically works on a yearly cycle where a new version is released at the end of each year. It will receive security and maintenance updates for 2 years, and then it will only receive security updates and then no updates. So if you're running an old version of PHP, you're essentially eventually going to be insecure. And so you want a hosting provider that proactively makes new versions available as they're available. And you, as much as possible, want to be running on one of the more recent versions. So currently, you want to be on either 8.0, 8.1, or 8.2. But 8.0 is only receiving security updates, and those will stop at the end of this year in November of 2023. So it's a good time to go in and update to 8.1 or 8.2. Do some testing. You can do this usually in a sandbox or in a test environment. Reaching out to customer support if you have any questions about this, they'll be more than happy to help you with this. That's usually good if you're not too technical savvy, because if there are issues, which sometimes happen, they can roll you back and help you go back to a stable state, where then you can figure out, okay, what is there a plugin? Is there a theme that I need to update before updating my version of PHP? Or you might have to report the problem to the plugin author, and then they fix it and you can update. But it's not always a straightforward process. And so that's why I have it in the advanced section, that you might need a little bit more extra help with that. But contacting Bluehost support is a great way to get started with that. And you might not even be sure what version of PHP you're running. This is one of those things that, for the most part, will work and will be secure behind the scenes that I talked about. And so sometimes it's good to just ask and reach out and see, maybe you are on the most recent version, or maybe you do need to spend some time updating, and they can help you with that. Another thing that you can do that many of the plugins I mentioned previously will help you with is setting up some htaccess rules. So htaccess is a file that will live in your in the root directory of your WordPress install. And it's basically a list of configurations for Apache to use. And Apache is something that runs on your web server, and it configures how to treat requests to certain directories in this context. And so basically what we would use this for is we would block people from being able to view all of the files in a folder on your web server. So you might have seen before, if you go to a website URL and then it's just a list of files that are links or folders that are links, and it might have the name at the top in big text. So that's essentially you're browsing a directory. And we in most cases, you don't want someone to be able to do that. A use case of this, or how this might manifest in your WordPress install, is maybe somebody's able to browse your WP content directory. And so if they do that, they would be able to see all the plugins you have installed, which themes you're using, what is in your upload directory. And so it's not always ideal, because it might expose some details that you would prefer not to be public or known. And like I said, all of those plugins that I mentioned have some level of ability to help you configure these with some recommendations. Another thing you can do is ensure that your website has salts defined. Salts are basically just cryptographic hashes, which you can see on this screenshot here. And what they do is, every time you log into WordPress, a cookie is stored in your browser. And when you don't have salts defined, it will just be plain text. They won't be they can just be read, and if somebody gets access to your computer, they could gather information from those. With salts, what will happen is any of the information that's stored will get passed through these salts before being stored. And so they'll essentially look like mumbo jumbo, just like this. And so it makes your users more secure, your website more secure. And it's just something that should always be defined in here in your website. If you open your wp-config.php file, you should see these in there somewhere. If you don't, They're very easy to get added. This website URL here is a URL that you can go to, and every time it loads, unique salts will be returned. And so you could copy and paste these and put them in your cell. Reaching out to Bluehost support is also a great way to confirm that these are defined in your site, or have them added. And there's also some plugins and themes that will be able to do that for you with a simple click. And last thing, should they be rotated? You can. It's not necessary, but if you have suspicions that your site has been hacked, it doesn't hurt to rotate the salts. One side effect of this, though, is that every time you rotate these, anybody that is logged into your website will be logged out, because then their login information will not match with the new salt, and so you have to replace them. So we've done all of this, but unfortunately, let's say that our site has been hacked. We've had a bad attack, and we need to figure out how to fix it and get back to normal. So what are some things that we should do? Devin mentioned at the top of the webinar that we should be proactive about this, and even when we're being reactive, being proactive can help, and that comes in the form of having a response plan. Just like having a fire evacuation plan in buildings, you should have a response plan for if there's a hack on your website. Hacks could be anything from, someone goes to your homepage and it just says hacked by so-and-so, or it could be redirecting to another site that's, full of malware, or wherever that hacker wants to send you. And so by creating this plan, you identify who you're going to need to rely on to help clean the website. And you're going to have the steps documented to restore a backup. I mentioned, knowing where you store your backups, knowing how to restore them, knowing how to get access to them. That's all stuff that you should have documented somewhere, so that when you have an attack, you can just pull up that document and that plan, and you're more prepared. You're less panicked. You know what you need to do. You have a list that you've prepared for yourself, and you'll be able to more quickly and more confidently address the issue. When you're recovering a site, you obviously want to clean out the hack. And one way to make sure that you do that is when you download backups, you can examine the backup before restoring it. So maybe you say, okay, I had a hack. It wasn't like that yesterday. Let me go back and look at yesterday's. And so you restore yesterday's in a staging site, and you look, but then you notice that there's some weird files in your WordPress install that you don't really know why they're there. That's a sign that, hey, maybe that attack was there and it wasn't being exploited yet. And so you might have to go back another day or a week until you find a point where your file system is not compromised. And then once you find and identify a safe one that you're confident in, you can restore that to your production site. Another thing to document is what level of reporting you have to give for when there are incidents, and which types of incidents require that type of reporting. So you may need to notify your users. Hey, we've had a vulnerability. We don't know how many accounts have been infected. Please reset your password, or we've reset everybody's password. Maybe you run a e-commerce store. Do you have to notify any authorities? Do you need to notify any payment processors or anything that you have attached to your website? Researching this ahead of time and knowing this, and maybe even you have a template email that you would send out to them. This is something just to have prepared, to know about ahead of time, to protect yourself, to protect the business, and look out for the best interests of your users on your website. And it's okay to seek professional help as well. You're not on your own. If you ever think that your site is compromised, you can always reach out to Bluehost support. They have tools to scan websites and check to see if if there is malware, if any known vulnerabilities are present on your website. Any of the service providers that I mentioned, from SiteLock to Jetpack, you can also reach out to them to get help restoring your website or looking for any security issues. But identifying these ahead of time and knowing who to rely on, again, is a great thing to document beforehand, so you know how to get help recovering your site if it is past your level of expertise and comfort. And I think that's it. Devin, if you want to hop on back, and I'm not sure if we have any questions to answer.
We do. We've got a couple questions. First of all, thank you, JD. That's super informative. And like I mentioned at the beginning, security sometimes isn't as glamorous because no one wants their site to be hacked. Obviously, no one wants to have to deal with that, but it is absolutely important and critical. So
And
we
some of
have a
those
couple.
things are not the most convenient, like having different passwords for every site, and maybe changing your password regularly. I know I always get annoyed when my sites tell me, "Oh, like you have to change your password if they enforce it." But in the long run, it's great for your site and your security. You should take the time to do those.
Completely agree on both accounts that it is annoying and that it is also absolutely important to do, especially for the long-term success of your website. So had a couple questions come in. I'm just going to rapid fire hit you with them, and we'll just get to as many as we can. If we don't get to your question, we'll try to respond in the comments. And if we don't get to it there, then we'll try to respond after the webinar via email or something like that. So the first housekeeping question, which always comes up, yes, this is being recorded. Yes, this will be sent out to everyone that attended and registered. So if you had to drop early or if you joined a few minutes late, don't worry, we'll still send out a recording and the slides and everything that you need to go back and view this at a little bit of a slower pace if that works better for you. So on to the questions for you, my friend. First question, how often should I update my WordPress site, plugins, and themes?
You should update your WordPress plugins and themes and WordPress code anytime there is an update. So I mentioned about running the latest and greatest all the time. It's one of the best things you can do to protect yourself against any vulnerabilities. Once there's a release and there's a security update in it, as soon as it's released, there are hackers that are reverse engineering it and trying to figure out how to exploit that vulnerability. And so installing that as soon as possible is the best way to keep yourself protected. But WordPress makes that really easy because, like I showed you, you can turn on auto updates for plugins and themes and also for WordPress core itself. And those are configured by default on Bluehost, and in WordPress, WordPress core will update by default. So keeping that enabled and allowing that to auto update is the best way. If you need to do manually, then maybe following, there's a blog, wordpress.org/news, and anytime there is a new release of WordPress, that gets published there. So maybe following that blog, if auto updating is not something you want to do, even though I highly recommend that you do, there are some valid instances where you might not want that to happen. I still recommend that you keep on top of that and update as soon as you can after releases happen.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. One of the reasons that you might not want to auto update is if you or your developer has done some custom coding in your theme or your plugin or something like that, which
You should always avoid that for that reason. But there are some scenarios. Yeah, I one of the ones I always use as an example is maybe you have some type of deployment strategy where you deploy directly from a source code repository or something like that. That might take some time, and you don't want it to auto update, because then the next time you deploy, it would just revert that change, right? You would want to update that in your process that you have set up to do it correctly going forward.
understood.
Yeah, if you are editing your plugins or themes directly, we'll have to figure out what webinar to link you to learn some different ways to not do that, because you don't want your updates to overwrite any changes that you have.
Definitely true. And if you do, obviously restore from a backup and contact Bluehost support. We can help you through that. Next question we have, are there any precautions I should take when using public Wi-Fi to access my WordPress site's admin panel?
Yeah, good question. Definitely you should have an SSL certificate connected and configured. obviously make sure people aren't looking over your shoulder and watching what you're doing and trying to read your passwords. And sensitive information. But yeah, that's the number one thing, is that would be prime for a man in the middle attack, where someone's just sitting at the cafe or wherever the public Wi-Fi is, and they're just watching who's communicating on the network. And if the data that you're sending and receiving is not encrypted, then you're just asking for them to steal that information. So that extends to other websites too. Make sure the sites you're using have HTTPS and have a SSL certificate configured.
Awesome. One other question that came in, someone says they might have missed it, but they said they're a small site. Why would a hacker want to try to hack them?
Yeah, good question. So that's kind of like the "it'll never happen to me" mentality, right? You Sometimes it's not um, about the level of information that they'll gain from hacking it. Sometimes it's just about controlling as many sites as possible. So sometimes you might have something like a distributed attack, where they're trying to attack a bigger website. Maybe they're trying to attack a news website or a bank. And if they just do it from one location, the bank or that site they're trying to hack is going to catch on really quickly and block them. But if they spread that attack out over many, many different connections and sites and locations, it's not going to look as suspicious as early. And it's really hard to block people from 500,000 IP addresses than it is to block one. And so a lot of times the strategy is not to use the information on the website, but just to have control of the website so that they can do more malicious things later on. Or maybe your website is connected to something else that they're trying to exploit. Maybe you use a third party service, and there's a way for them to get information about that third party service through the connection that your website has with that service. So it might not be directly that they want your website, it's that your website can enable them to have a more sophisticated hack or exploit for something else that they're looking at.
Yeah, and I would maybe just add to that that oftentimes it's not a personal attack on any individual's website. Oftentimes it's just someone that has written a script or enabled a bot that would just crawl the web and look for specific vulnerabilities with, as we mentioned, core files, plugins, themes, and things like that. So it's very, very
Yeah.
rarely a personal attack on your specific website. It's more often than not their bot that they've provisioned finds the vulnerability on your website and exploits that.
Yeah, they don't really care about Sally's flower shop, right? They've never been. Most of the time those will surface in the form of Yelp or something like that, right? But yeah, this is a good point, Devin.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question: are there any specific security measures I should take when using third-party themes and plugins?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I see is that people will buy a third party plugin or theme, and then they'll reach out to the support for that plugin or theme, and the developer will be like, "Okay, well, if you give me a login, I can go in and help you configure it," which is fine, but you shouldn't be giving them your password and username. You shouldn't be maybe you shouldn't be giving them an administrator account depending on what they need to help you configure. Um, and you should definitely remove their access after they help you. And so that goes back to that concept I was talking about limiting your access and only giving out what is absolutely necessary in order to have someone work on your website. And with that, you have to make sure they're reputable. Make sure that other people are not saying, "Well, they help me," and then I started having all these issues. I started having this weird thing where my website would redirect people to something else. Just some things to be aware of there. It's I'm not saying it's bad in all instances, but you definitely want to be cautious, and you definitely want to have some safeguards in place when you're doing that.
Yep. And I would add to that: when in doubt, read reviews. I think that's a
Yep.
great way to find out whether people's experiences were with that specific plugin or theme, and if they're reputable, and if they're engaging with their user base to help anyone that has issues with their product. Okay, moving on to the next question. Can you provide tips for preventing brute force attacks on a WordPress site?
Yeah, so this one is going to definitely require that you rely on some type of service or plugin. We The one that we most commonly use is Jetpack, and Jetpack has a feature called Brute Force Protect. Jetpack Protect, it's called, I think. But essentially, that's a brute force protection. And so I talked about how Cloudflare, if a bad user comes to my website and then they try to go to Devin's website, Cloudflare will already know that they're a bad user. The same is true for anybody trying to brute force a website. So if I'm using Brute Protect within Jetpack, um, and someone's trying to brute force my website and they've been flagged as suspicious, and then they go to Devin's website, they'll automatically be flagged as well. And so um, that's one that I recommend. There are some other options out there as well. You can also handle this at the the DNS level, which Cloudflare does a level of that, but may not do it specifically in the context of WordPress. Um, check find a service that works for you. There's plenty of reputable WordPress plugins that will also help you with that.
Okay, awesome. We still have a handful of questions, but only a few more minutes. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. Rapid fire round,
All right.
if possible. Obviously we want to make sure that the questions are answered. This one is a great question. Are there any hosting providers that specialize in WordPress security?
Yeah. So Bluehost is WordPress is what we do, and so I know it might sound like we're tooting our own horn, but I mean that's what we specialize in. We focus on that 365, and so we definitely like to think that we are pretty good at WordPress security. There's plenty of other ones out there. It really comes down to asking the right questions. Do you enable auto updates? How are you updating PHP? Do you make updates available to us in a timely fashion? Um, things like that. All those questions that I talked about earlier in the workshop. Yeah, those are things that you would just ask your hosting provider to confirm that.
100% agree, and I'll echo what you said that Bluehost focused specifically on WordPress hosting, so we make sure that our platform is safe, secure, and performant when it comes to WordPress. So
One other
definitely
thing you can ask too is if they contribute to WordPress, and so I'm employed at Bluehost to contribute to WordPress, and that's my full time job. And one of the things that I do to contribute is I'm on the security team, and so having people in the community that are active that help WordPress be more secure and have less bugs and all of those things is a great sign that they are in the know and that they are working proactively to protect WordPress installs.
perfect. Okay, next question. What measures can I take to protect my WordPress site from DDoS attacks?
Yeah, DDoS is, in case you don't know, is a distributed denial of service attack. So that's something I talked about where they might not be interested in your site specifically. They're more interested in having control of as many sites as possible to carry things like this out. This is something, again, you would definitely want to rely on something like Cloudflare or Jetpack or something that will help identify these things automatically. Because if you're under a DDoS attack, it's really difficult without someone that's super tech savvy to know how to circumvent that or prevent that. So you definitely want to rely on a service provider that can help you with this.
And I know that we have some tools that sit server side before it even gets to your site. So if our
Yep,
servers detect,
most hosting providers will have that a level of that as well.
Yep. Okay, one or two more questions. What are some indicators or warning signs that my WordPress site might have been compromised?
This is a good one. So this kind of surfaces in many ways. So the most obvious would be you go to your website and it goes somewhere else that it's not supposed to. It goes to Devin's toy shop or whatever website that hacker is trying to get more attention to. Another would be that the content on your website is not what it should be. Maybe they had a SQL injection attack and they replaced all your content in the database. but it can also be much more subtle. And one of the more common ones is that you go to edit your users and you look and I don't remember that administrator account. I don't know where that came from. And sometimes what'll happen is they will attack the site and they might add an administrator account and not do anything, but they have it there and they can always come back later, or maybe they log in and look around and they don't do anything because they don't want to tip you off. And so regularly going to your user page and auditing your user permissions and who the administrators are and all that is another good way to look out for that.
Okay, and let's see, one or two more. How can I conduct a security audit of my existing WordPress site? I think that kind of goes along with the previous question of vulnerability.
Yeah. So if you reach out to Bluehost support, we have a bunch of tools that we can use to audit your site and confirm whether or not you have issues. If you have something like Jetpack, they have something called their backup is called WordPress. And I forget what their security scanning feature is, but it's constantly scanning your website in the background to make sure that there's no known malware or vulnerabilities that it can identify.
Okay, awesome. And I think this is going to be the last question that we end on. What should I do if my WordPress site is flagged as potentially harmful by search engines or security scanners?
Yeah, this is another way that most people probably find out that their site has been hacked. A lot of times they'll give you a reason, or at least a category for the reason in the right direction. Sometimes they'll give you an exact page that has the issue. And so when you have that information, get as much information as you can from that person that's flagging it, or that site that's flagging it. And then step back and try to find the issue yourself, or reach out to support and tell them what's going on. Some of these plugins and themes and tools that I mentioned, they have ways to they will identify most of those issues for you without even having to go to that search engine or whoever's flagging you. So definitely lean on those services that you have, and Bluehost support is another one. And yeah, you might have to do a little information seeking and problem solving, but that's kind of the best way to go from there.
Yep, and I advanced the slide to this final slide, how to get assistance from Bluehost, just in case anyone's not aware. You can call at that number. You can also go to our helplines at bluehost.com/help. YouTube has a lot of walkthroughs, and our additional webinars are there, and we also have professional services, which you can get to by filling out the form in the chat, the one that's pinned to the top. So a lot of different helplines. We want to be here. We want to be seen as a partner in your website building process. So if there's anything that we can do to help you take the next step, please don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us, for sticking through this. And JD, thank you so much for teaching us about this. Absolutely critical information. I can't tell you how many people I've spoken with that are upset that they didn't do anything before they were hacked to make their site more secure, and they wish that they would have. So a couple of easy things that you can do to make sure your site is more secure, and a few more advanced things as well. So thank you so much for stopping by and helping us out. And we'll talk to you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.